Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little. I'm here today with another hand for PokerNews.com. I want to thank you all for being here with me today. Hope your week has gone amazingly well. If you're bored, check out my podcast, Weekly Poker Hand. You can find it on iTunes or YouTube or also on my website, jonathanlittlepoker.com/WPH, stands for Weekly Poker Hand. And also there are a lot of educational blogs there. So if you like this kind of content, presumably you do because you've watched a bunch of these, check that out too. So in this hand, we are facing a raise from a good kid playing pretty deep stacked, about 130 big blinds deep from the cutoff, and we have Ace-6 offsuit in the big blind. Now, this is not a good hand at all. If there are no antes in play and the opponent makes it a little bit bigger, like 500 or 600, as you see happen in a lot of smaller stakes games where people use bigger raise sizes, I definitely think I can just fold. But when you're facing a 2.5 big blind raise, I think you probably have to defend, but you certainly don't like defending with the Ace-6 offsuit. It is not a good hand. It's going to make a lot of very marginal holdings, and marginal holdings from out of position are not really where you want to be. So on the flop, we get middle pair. There are times where you want to consider leading. The times to lead are usually when the board is very coordinated and you have a hand that either wants to bet for value / protection. Often that's going to be like a good top pair. Like say it comes 6-5-4, 2 hearts, right? I don't really mind betting because if my opponent folds, whatever he folds is going to have some amount of equity on 6-5-4, right? He just has to have overcards or something. Also in that spot, I'd want to lead with some very good draws, like a good flush draw, for example, or a flush draw with no showdown value, like Queen Jack of clubs or something like that, or Queen Jack of hearts, whatever the flush draw is. So that's the spot where you want to lead. As the board becomes more dry, though, you typically don't want to lead. And that's because the preflop raiser usually has a range advantage, meaning their raising range should be stronger than my range, calling the big blind, because I did not 3-bet, right? That takes away some of my best hands, but my opponent could still have those best hands in his range. And also, I'm going to be out of positions. And typically, from out of position, you want to keep the pot manageable. If I lead with this, or anything really, and get raised, I'm not loving it. I would much rather check and see what develops. So I'm going to check. When my opponent bets 500, I am typically just going to call in this scenario. I could be convinced that raising may be better if your opponent will play really, really straightforwardly against a raise. Now, I don't assume someone who I have labeled as a good kid is going to play really, really, really straightforwardly. So for that reason, I don't really like a raise. When we are raising, we're raising just purely for protection, and protection is often overrated. Turns to 3. The reason I say protection is overrated, by the way, is because what you're protecting against usually has maybe 20% equity at most on dry boards like this, and if your opponent gets to draw to 20% to win the pot in exchange for me not having to play a big pot when I'm in bad shape, it's usually worth it. And also our opponent can keep bluffing when he misses. Like say he's sitting here with Queen Jack, he may decide to keep bluffing, which isn't the end of the world. So anyway, I checked, check called. On the turn I check and the opponent checks behind. So when he checks behind, I am thinking I have the best hand almost every time at this point, unless he has 9s, 8s, or 7s. So we're in pretty good shape. Going to the river though, I'm usually not going to be able to value bet because quite often the river is going to put an overcard on the board to my 6. And whatever my opponent's giving up with may randomly hit that card. And if he missed, like say he has Jack 9, for example, and the river's a 7. If I bet, he's going to fold, right? But say the river's a Jack or a 9, he's going to call. So he's going to play very, very well against a value bet. So for that reason, I'm often going to be checking the river. River's a queen. So, like I just said, I'm going to check. And now the opponent bets 1,100 into the 1,900 pot. So now, if I call, the pot's going to go up to about 4,000. So I have to put in 1,100 to win a pot that's going to be about 4,000. So I need to win about 27-ish% of the time. I know I throw out numbers here somewhat haphazardly. I don't have a calculator in front of me, as you can see. I'm just talking to you all. But I think I need to win about 26 or 27% of the time to justify calling. Sometimes my numbers may be wrong. Please forgive me if that's the case. So the question is, am I good here 26 or 27% of the time? And there's no great way of knowing. Because I think my opponent is good, that makes me more inclined to think he's going to bet in a somewhat balanced manner. Or he's going to look for very obvious bluff spots and take them with way too many bluffs. So which cards are obviously good to bluff on? Well, mostly overcards to the 6, which is going to be most of the deck. So this is a spot where I definitely think a lot of good players are probably going to be bluffing a little bit too much. And if the opponent's bluffing a little bit too much, what should I do to counteract that? Well, I should probably start calling with a few more hands than I normally would. Now, I think this hand is probably just a call under almost all scenarios. But say I had Ace-3 instead, I think that's also just going to be a call. And that's because I do think this player, or a lot of good players, are going to bluff with King-Jack, Jack-9, 9-8, 9-7, 8-7, etc. Maybe even ace-highs, like bad ace-high, like ace-7, he may decide to bluff. So this is a spot where I think we have a pretty easy call. And yeah, I'm going to make it. Before we see if I win or not, I don't know if I won or not, but I still think it's a good call. You're going to find that if you play your hands in a somewhat passive manner, you're going to induce bluffs. What a lot of recreational players do incorrectly is they play their hands really strong. Like say I check raise the flop and my opponent called, and then I bet the turn and my opponent called, and then I check the river and he bet. Well, I have a pretty easy fold with my middle pair, or even top pair then. But because I've played this hand so passively, that's going to induce players to bluff because they think my range is much weaker than it actually is. And if they are going to think your range is weaker than it is, well, then they should be bluffing a decent amount, or maybe even value betting with a worse hand. I mean, I would not be shocked to see pocket 5s decide to randomly value bet. I don't think it's a good value bet, but sometimes it happens. So anyway, if you are playing a very aggressive strategy and your opponents still want to put their money in, you should be making very big folds. But if you play in a somewhat passive manner, then, and your opponent wants to put money in, that doesn't necessarily indicate extreme strength. So easy call here. Like I said, I'd probably call with any 3. I was about to say maybe I'd call with ace-jack or better. And sure enough, the opponent has king-jack. So he did decide to bluff the river in a spot where the river was obviously a scary card. And I think this is a fine bluff from the opponent, or for the opponent, by the way. Assuming he thinks I'm capable of folding. As we see, or as I just told you, I may not even fold ace-jack in this spot. So if I'm not folding ace-jack in this spot, purely due to pot odds for the most part, then maybe the opponent needs to chill out with his bluffs. And an easy way to take advantage of someone like myself, who's going to call you a lot, is to stop bluffing so much. However, the downside to not bluffing so much is that now I, Jonathan J. Cardshark here, gets to check call the flop much wider with marginal made hands, knowing you're not going to try to bluff me. And then that makes my life easy. So this kind of shows you the power of playing somewhat cautiously, but at the same time not folding. It definitely puts your opponents in tough spots where if they bluff too much, you can easily snap them off. And if you realize they are no longer bluffing you very much, well, then you can just check call the flop a ton and then check it down and win at showdown a lot. So strategy works pretty well, even from out of position, which is where usually you're going to have your most difficult spots. So that's going to be it for this hand for PokerNews.com. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, tell your friends. Good luck in your games. Be nice to each other. And I'll talk to you next week.